Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 275, Rhythms of Sacred Protest. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we continue our series of conversations with Jews of trans experience with an incredible guest, Koach Frazier. A few years ago, Koach Frazier opened a powerful talk that was part of Avoda's Speak Torah to Power series by saying that he is a person who stands at the intersection of hate and oppression in America, as a person who is Black, trans, and Jewish. Koach goes on to say that he is nevertheless determined to thrive. And he is not only thriving for himself, but also bringing, as you'll hear, transformative ideas to all of us. I'll start by saying that Koach Frazier is a rabbinical student at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Seminary. But on the way to becoming a rabbinical student, he has done a number of other things, including being a doctor of audiology, somebody who helps people hear better. In addition to being an audiologist, Koach Frazier is a musician, a co-convener of the Tzedek Lab, a national multiracial network of political education trainers, organizers, spiritual leaders, and cultural workers, Jews and allies, established to build collective competency to better politicize, transform, and inspire the Jewish community into collective action against racism, anti-Semitism, and white supremacy. He is also a steering committee member of the Jewish Liberation Fund, who we talked to a few months ago. Koach describes himself as a queer trans Jew who is working towards the day everyone experiences liberation. A collaborative and spiritual leader, he travels the nation striving to dismantle racism and actualize liberation. For a long time, Koach Frazier was living in St. Louis, Missouri, where he was on the boards of the Missouri GSA Network and Central Reform Congregation. Koach Frazier got involved in social justice and came to prominence in part through his work in the protest movement in the wake of the killing by police of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. We are so excited to have this conversation. So Koach Frazier, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thanks for having me here.
Well, it's a long time coming. We're very excited. So I actually want to start, even though we're on this series on trans and Judaism, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, but I actually want to talk about somebody coming to do what you're doing, which is to be in rabbinical school after a career in another field. I'm just curious about that because up till relatively recently, being a rabbi was like something that people did more or less out of college. And as somebody who's now on the old side, I kind of feel like, I actually have learned a lot in the last 30 years. And if I were to become a rabbi, which I, God forbid, would never be, but if I did today, I would be much better at it than I would have been 30 years ago. And so I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about how you made that decision to become a rabbi after having done something else for a long time? And how has that influenced the way that you experience being a rabbinical student?
One of the things that was on my mind when I decided that I wanted to go to rabbinical school was, as a kind of leader, a spiritual leader in community already in St. Louis, Missouri, which is where I'm most recently from, people were already assigning the title rabbi to me, and it felt very strange. So that was one thing that propelled me into rabbinical school. The other thing is that I spent a lot of time as an audiologist, and I was starting to notice that some of the people who were coming to me weren't necessarily coming to me for their physical, let's say, problems or their physical situations, that they were actually coming to me. And I was more so as their chaplain than I was their audiologist. And as that started to shift, I said, you know what? I think I should go to school. So that I've gone to school for audiology, and I felt like my career was great. And I also knew that there was foundational learning that made that career great. along with the experience. And so I decided that I needed to go to rabbinical school to get some foundational learning so that those moments in time when I'm spending with people as their rabbi, that foundation is there.
Well, I'm sure this is going to happen to you once you become a rabbi, that all these people are going to come to you for ideological questions.
It's already happened.
Yeah, I'm sure. So the way that you're describing that, though, that the way you experienced in Missouri sounds to me like what I would call, as somebody trained as a lawyer, a ratification. You know, it's something where you're already actually a rabbi. You're actually functioning in the way that people understand this is what a rabbi does. But there's some desire to make that official. You know, in other words, is it possible that what we're actually seeing in a story like yours is almost like a common law rabbi, somebody who becomes a rabbi without any certification, and that maybe you don't even need to go to rabbinical school?
If we look back at how rabbis became rabbis before, I mean, there really wasn't this kind of, you go off to school and learn particular things in terms of what it means to be quote unquote a rabbi. But, you know, people see in you your ability to be with the people, ability to transfer energy and learning into the community. And so 3 other rabbis would put their hands on you and then you would be a rabbi. So I feel like there's probably a lot of that even still going on today, which is great. And I think that there is value in doing some learning or situating yourself with other people, like learning with other rabbis so that you can feel like you're in the line of tradition, and as it were.
I will name something about myself that is maybe a little risky. You mentioned that traditionally the way you become a rabbi is people put their hands on you, or rabbis who have previously been made rabbis put their hands on you, and then you're a rabbi. Because of the pandemic, when I was ordained a rabbi in January, I did not have any rabbis place their hands on me. So there's a sense in which you could argue I'm still not actually a rabbi. I kind of like that ambiguity. As listeners of the show know, I like being this sort of straddler of what it means to be a rabbi and what it means to rebel against rabbis. So that's like perfect for me. But just to be clear, all the others who were ordained with me, please call them rabbi if they want you to, all that stuff. Okay, so that's out of the way. But
it sounds very Reconstructionist, by the way, Lex, because that is actually like this sense of needing to transfer tradition through the hands is not something that is actually done, to my knowledge, at the RRC.
Interesting.
There's a different practice of like transferring that title in the tradition in that way.
That's really interesting. So without going into details, I think that we could have a whole conversation just about what ordination is. We'll go to other places now, but I'm curious. You said that people were already calling you rabbi, seeing you as serving that role. And I got to ask, like, what kind of rabbiing were you doing? Like, what was causing them to call you that? I have some guesses based on what I know about you, but when you think about the work that you do while rabbiing, what is it?
So some of it was the fact that I was doing spiritual leadership in the Jewish community there in St. Louis when it comes to like helping to lead services and sharing, Divrei Torah, sharing words of Torah, on Shabbat. It also extended into the street, where as an activist, I was using my drum to go to protest. And I was a full-on participant in the Ferguson Uprising in 2014. And part of my role, as I saw it, was to show up as an energy worker. I think my grandfather, blessed memory, who was a AME minister, I would watch him do that kind of work in community, in his community in Florida. And so showing up as a kind of spiritual, energetic presence when there was high tension, that was part of, I think I saw as my rabbinic role, or my role as a spiritual leader in St. Louis. That's where I think formationally I was like, yeah, I'm doing this kind of work out there. And also being with the people as a chaplain, wouldn't call myself a movement chaplain per se in those moments, but I wouldn't assign myself that title, but I was doing that kind of work out on the streets in St. Louis.
So I kind of feel like we are moving backwards in time in order to move forward, but I'm also curious about how you became that. How did you become that street drumming activist? Like, was that something that you had been doing before? And here, the Ferguson, right? We're talking about the Michael Brown and everything that happened in Ferguson.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, what were you in terms of social activism?
Well, as a queer person, and as a Black person, I feel like I've been kind of like born into activism by virtue of wanting to be free. And I come from a long line of AME preachers. So African Methodist Episcopal tradition, it's a Christian tradition that sprung up because of racism here in America. And Richard Allen, who's the founder of the AME Church, became not that he wasn't an activist before, but as an act of I need to create a space for people, since we've been told we can't practice our spirituality in this place. I have to create a different place, a different space for us. And so that's what he did. So I feel like even my spiritual tradition launched me into activism as I was born into it. And across the years, that has been present in my life. I remember being a student at St. Louis University and joining the Black Student Alliance. And that was also a formative time as an activist, actually actively protesting the administration, who put as artwork on the street of, it was Grand Avenue, which is St. Louis University is situated in Midtown, or the city of St. Louis. The population of people, mostly Black and brown folks there. But we have a university that attends to a lot of white folks. And so you have this university kind of placed inside the city with a gate around it. Yet there's this thoroughfare called Grand Boulevard, where in front of the Student Center, they put a statue of a half-naked African woman who was on a slave block, an auction block, and having to actively resist against the administration to get that removed from the street. So there's just so many ways in which I've been in a position, I've been in a place where something needed to move, something needed to happen, something needed to shift. And based off of my spiritual upbringing, I've learned that you just need to go and do what needs to be done. You can't wait for other people to do it. And that's what kind of propelled me to be on the streets in Ferguson. I like to actually tell this story about what happened, because when Mike Brown of blessed memory was killed by the police officer, he was killed on Shabbat. And I didn't know about it because I had my phone off. When I turned my phone back on, I was inundated with all these messages about this Black teenager who was killed, and that there had been protests. Even that Sunday, by the time I had learned that there was going to be a prayer vigil at the then just parking lot of where the Ferguson jail was being built, I went and had no idea that his body had laid there for 4.5 hours. That was news to me the Sunday after he died. And so when Reverend Tracy Blackman had called for the clergy to come together to pray, I went. And the young people, they stayed there for a second, and they said, you know what, we're done praying, and then we're going to sit on the ground. They took the street. They said, we're going to sit in the street for 4.5 hours, the same time frame that Mike's body stayed there. So I went out on the street with them. Again, there was this push, we got to do something needs to shift. And when that shifted, I went with them and I sat on the ground, and all of a sudden they started saying, sitting down for Michael Brown, sitting down for Michael Brown. I heard a beat in my head because I'm a drummer. And so I went to my car and I got my drum, which I happen to have there, and I started playing. And that's kind of how it started, that I moved into being part of the energy work that was happening out on the streets.
So that's incredibly powerful. And I want to come back to drumming specifically and sound. We'll get there. But before we do, I want to think about that situation you just described. I reflect sometimes, there's the famous quote, Abraham Joshua Heschel, my legs were praying at Selma. And it's on one level a nice quote. On another, when you say that an act of protest is sacred because it's like praying. You're implying that praying is the holy thing. And, protest is good when it sort of resembles that other thing, which is praying. And I think it sets up this hierarchy where like we conceptualize holy action as, top of the list, prayer, and then lower on the list, sacred protest in the streets. And I love what you just described with, the younger people. They went to that gathering of the clergy for a second. They're like, okay, this is nice, but now we're gonna sit in the streets now. We're gonna do the thing, because the thing is actually not the prayer; it's the sitting in the street. It's not that their crossed legs were praying; it's that I want to invert it. Like the prayers were doing a sit-in if they were good prayers. I don't know the languaging to do for that, but hopefully I'm being somewhat coherent. I want to hear more from you about. I mean, whether it's that specific scenario in Ferguson or in general as somebody who is an activist, like, is the rabbiing actually of value because it seeds, SEEDS, that other sacred work?
I think that what the moment that I was describing was actually a turning point for a lot of clergy folks out there, that they then looked at their role and said, no, maybe our role isn't to be, creating these spaces where we just pray. That maybe it is for us to be in support of the young people who are leading us in this moment of crisis. It was good for me. I'm 43 years old, slightly younger then. But most people consider me to be a young person, which is really cute. And so I was almost kind of the in between. So I was kind of the liaison's a bad word, but just like I was a person who could like float between the elders and the young folks, and to be a translator often of what was the conversations that were happening out on the street. And I feel like one of the things I learned really well there is that my job is actually not to show up and tell people what to do and or to create punishments or anything like that for what's happening. My role is to listen. My role is to be a presence, to be a witness to what's happening. And when called upon to join and do a thing with the other people, is to answer the call. And so when they would call me and tell me, okay, it's time to bring the drum. We need the drum here, or we need less drum, or can you help us divert attention this way? That's what I was there to do. And that was my work. And it felt very rabbinic to be in that role, to be there as a person who will actually listen to what people are saying and to listen to what is not being said. A lot of times what would happen is clergy would come out there and they'd say, well, when we come out here, we're not going to engage in antagonization in whatever way they felt was antagonization against police officers who showed up. We're not going to use certain words. We're not going to, and all of this stuff. And it's like, you know what? Actually, you don't know what's best. You know what's best for you. And that's good to know. Hold boundaries for yourself, but don't allow your boundaries to seep upon other people. And actually, they were preventing righteous work that was happening with the young people. And so I tried to translate that back to some of the folks who were used to being the leaders in protests. Like you think about a long line of particularly Black church faith leaders being in charge of protests across the country. And this was a moment where folks were able to step back and say, you know what, there's a new group of people who are leading, and they're not necessarily from the church. Thank God. Right. Here's this Black trans Jewish person who ain't in the church, who's out here also. Right. And we started to see there were Muslim folks and there were other people of no tradition at all and of various other traditions who were actually holding space that felt very spiritual. And what I do want to say, in response to what Lex, you were saying before about this kind of push and pull with prayer and protest. You'll hear Reverend Tracy Blackman say all the time, I've had better church out on the street than I've had in a building in a long time, because what was happening out there was actual spiritual work. And when we can see it for what it was and what it continues to be, then we don't have to have the binary of the praying and the protesting.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you a version of a question that now I think is a little different because of what you just said. I was going to ask you something along the lines of, when you think about particularly how the Black church has been part of, and like you say, like, because this is why it was created. I mean, this is its origin story has been part of this world of protest. And obviously, Martin Luther King is the great exemplar of that, at least for white people. Think of him that way. And I was thinking about, what's going on these days in Atlanta and how they've created this racist and all sorts of other bad things voting law. But one of the things that was interesting to me was how they say, well, it's particularly racist to say that voter registration is closed on Sundays because in the black church, they have souls to the polls. And the idea is that we would go directly from church to register folks to vote. Whereas, in the Jewish world, if you closed the voting registration on Shabbat, everybody would be like, oh, how wonderful, like how thoughtful that is. It's the opposite of anti-Semitism. But like part of that is like, it makes me wonder, like, well, maybe we're doing something wrong because, if the Jews are just taking Shabbat to kind of hang out and pray and the black church is saying, no, this is a day of prayer and activism because they're connected, that maybe we have a lot to learn there as Jews. But I'm also wondering about connecting that to what you just said, which was kind of like a little bit of relief that in this case, the black church leaders were not in charge and that there's some value to that not necessarily being the paradigm, and maybe as Jews, we shouldn't be trying to sort of model the next wave of Judaism on what the black church has been, if that isn't really so great in certain ways. So I guess in part I'm asking, based on all of those experiences and others, is there a vision of a better way to have Judaism that's emerging in your own mind and that you imagine sort of working toward, or you already are, but afterwards, like, how would it look different if it was better?
There's wisdom in Shabbos, and I wouldn't want folks to think that because some other group uses their time of rest and reflection as a means of activism in a particular way that we would have to mimic that. I highly believe that we should be doing as much as we can 6 days and to actually take a break. This is something I learned the hard way as an activist in Ferguson. I was actively going to protest on Shabbos, which I felt was like what I needed to do. It was taxing and also it was beneficial. And, oftentimes I was the only drummer. And so I would go out after services. I would tell them I'm going to service. I'm going to go so I could do both, chew gum and walk at the same time. So I would do this thing where I would go to services and then I would go out, and I was exhausted. I think we need the rest. And maybe it's that, Friday before Shabbat, it ushers in. We make sure that everybody had gone to the post before they went to service. Like, I think there's ways we can navigate around our own boundaries of time. And I think that there's a lot for other people to learn about that boundary of time. Are there ways we can use our imagination of what the world could be on Shabbos to work from the rest of the 6 days of the week? There's a lot to learn from that.
So you used a framework of boundary of time. I want to focus in really sharply on that because I want to talk about drumming. Now, why do those two things relate? Boundary of time. That's a rhythmic phrase, to have time boundaries. That's what a time signature does in music, etc. In prepping for this episode, I wandered around online and learned lots of amazing things about you. You use a phrase in your biography, in describing yourself, that I thought was so beautiful. And I also thought it's the kind of phrase that a drummer specifically would use. And what you say is, my heart beats to the rhythm of tikva, teshuva. I'll translate these terms in a second. My heart beats to the rhythm of tikva, teshuva, and tzedek. I want to hear how you understand those terms, but I would roughly put them as hope, repair, and justice. You've mentioned that you have your drum in your car that you're able to just grab at all times. And you've done that at protests, and you've used phrases like boundary of time. Like, I'm hearing from you, big word, sound metaphors. I'm hearing from you somebody who just embodies sound and feels out the world through beats and rhythms. And that makes sense because you're an audiologist and you work with the realm of sound. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit about that. I mean, that's not something, we've never had a guest on the show who's an audiologist. We are a sound modality on this podcast. Nobody sees us. We're just in their ears. Tell us more about your relationship to sound and to drumming, and how does it tie to rhythms of Judaism, rhythms of your life in other ways?
So I guess I'll start with my heartbeat, which is a rhythm. Part of that comes from when I was out on the street, and initially the people told us that like we were just standing there very near where Mike was murdered. Very shortly after the protest started, the police said that we could no longer have protests that were in place. We had to move. And so eventually the drum was used in order to provide a cadence for our movement. Then I became known in some places as the heartbeat of the Ferguson uprising, that the drum beat was actually part of how keeping the pulse of what was happening. And I thought a lot about like a heartbeat, part of me that keeps me alive, right? That like is pumping all the time. Unless it's not, then I'm not alive, right? But it's giving me life. When I think about the things that give me life, I'm not necessarily a hopeful person, but I feel like I have to believe that hope. I have to believe in hope, that like there is something beyond what I'm experiencing. So I have that hope giving me life. I have this desire to want to turn and return to myself and my community in atonement for like the harm that I know that I will create, and the harm that I know I will experience because we are humans. Teshuvah, like I want to be able to continue to return. That's the only that will keep us alive. And then justice, as opposed to JUSTUS, just us, which has been the experience of the criminal system here in America that has created a place that has excluded so many people, including people who share the many identities that I have. And so that keeps me alive to think that maybe at some point we will experience actual justice. That's kind of what I think about when I think about my heart beating to those, to Tikva and Teshuvah and Tzedek. And in terms of like this, the words I use, I don't even know that I think about it. It's just so a part of me that, right. And it's been a part of me, I think, since I've been a kid. I come from a tradition of like Black folks speaking rhythm like this. Like there's just even the cadence in the way we talk. It's something that I've just grown up listening to, and it becomes a part of who I am. And as an audiologist, as I learned about how sound travels through the outer ear, and then like you have this eardrum, right? You have an actual membrane inside your ear that they call a drum that actually like kind of pulsates with the sound and then sends energy to these three tiniest bones in your body that then rustles up some fluid that has these like ions in it in your inner ear that sends pulses to your nerves and then like goes up to your brain, and your brain hears it. So like your ear is a really wonderful way of getting sound to your brain. It is a vessel that allows your brain to get information that then your brain has to figure out what to do with it. It's fascinating to me. It lights me up to like even talk about the process, because the process is so wonderful and we didn't create it. We were created, and this creation of this funnel, this vessel that allows us to communicate with each other is absolutely fantastic. And I love the fact that we have the ability to enter into communication with each other through many different ways. Like sometimes it's through music, sometimes it's through words, and sometimes it's through the pauses between all of that that allow us to actually understand what's happening with each other.
It's a beautiful image. And as you were describing it, and I was like sinking into the metaphor, and particularly thinking about minority types of Jews, in other words, people that are a kind of Jew that is not your Ashkenazi, whatever kind of Jew. And are folks like that the eardrum, the drumming in a different way, which is going to ultimately get the brain to think differently? That's one way of putting it into the metaphor. And another way is like, maybe this is going too far, but like a brain transplant, that the whole organism itself needs to be different. I've been thinking about this a lot lately because there's a lot of talk at the time that we're recording this, because a number of big Jewish foundations have announced that there are these grants that are available to like reset the whole Jewish world, think profoundly differently about Jewish systems and whatever. And I always think that people are thinking too small. It's like, I always think like, well, what a real reset would be if the majority of Jews in America were Black, or if there were so many Jews that were trans that it wasn't even like a question anymore that we have to sort of talk about. It was just part of who Jews are. So I guess I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, as when you think about resets, or when you think about utopian visions of what a future Judaism or what the Jews might look like in the future, like where does your mind start to go? How do you start to think about those kinds of questions?
I'm trying to stay with your metaphor. And what I would say is that we have these little things inside the inner ear. They're cells and they look like hair. So they call them hair cells. And they respond to the different sounds. Like it's like they create an equalizer in your ear. And so like you have some of the hair cells that only respond to high frequencies and some that respond to mid frequencies and low frequencies. What happens when you hear a really loud sound, the hair cells kind of do this thing where they respond and they kind of wither a little bit, for lack of a better word, but they regenerate, they reset. What happens though is over time, if you don't make different decisions about how you take in sound, they'll no longer regenerate. And then you can't hear certain frequencies. We get the loud boom, like, oh, other Jews exist besides folks who came from Eastern Europe. Wow. So we regenerate, like we bounce back and we do this thing where we're like, okay, let's throw all our money at this one group of people, or let's throw all our money there. But then we don't actually make different decisions about how we are in community. We aren't any less racist with each other. We aren't any less transphobic with each other. We aren't any less sexist. And so then what happens is our hair cells, they just wither away and die. And that's what happens with, I think, the Jewish community. That's what's happening when we don't attend to what the actual problem is. And the problem isn't money. The problem is that we aren't practiced at being with other people who don't share all of our identities. We're not practiced with that. We need to make different decisions about how we are in community. This happens in every community. It happens in movement spaces. We aren't practiced with building actual relationships, like actual relationships that are honest about how we want to be with each other, about those boundaries we want to have with each other, and the agreements and the covenants that we need to make with each other, so that when the big boom happens, next time we have on ear protection. Like, we know what to do. We know what to expect. We know to expect that there are going to be people who don't look like us who show up at our synagogues. This should not surprise us. So what are we doing so that we're not surprised every time and we forget our ear protection so that our hair cells don't die?
So that's a huge question. And now I want to bring not the big boom, the big loud noise, but the silence. I thought it was beautiful the way you quickly mentioned that often our communication is between the words. Mm-hmm. That's huge. And I've quoted my high school concert band teacher on the podcast in the past. I'm going to do it now, and I'm probably going to end up doing it again in the future. Sorry, everyone, not sorry. But he had us practice the rests in some of our songs that we would play. We would literally sit there in the band room and we'd play like half a measure and stop. And then we'd like, if it was a big collective cutoff, and we would practice that multiple times in a row. And it taught me, and it's sunk into me, that so much of how we communicate, how we convey meaning, whether it's in a song or in communication, is in the breakpoints between. And so given that you just gave us a beautiful, beautiful, powerful metaphor about what those biggest sounds are, I'm curious if you would give us another Jewish metaphor. Sorry to just ask you to pull these out of nowhere, but like if you have thoughts on the space between sounds. And like to start it off, I'm thinking of the famous Jewish teaching about how in the Torah, there's the black fire, the ink that's written on the page, the words, and then there's the white fire, which is the space between the letters, the margins, and all of that. And I think that white fire is comparable to the space between the sounds. And as somebody who spends a lot of my time editing this podcast, I can tell you, like, when I sometimes make cuts in the audio that would look like I'm not cutting anything. Like I'm cutting blank space so that instead of 2 seconds of break, it's a half second of break. Or I'm adding in space so that it's 2 seconds of break instead of a half second, because stuff sits with you differently. You hear it differently, and all of a sudden something that would have just passed on by, if you sit with it for a second, it sits with you. So I'm curious, bring that audiology brilliance. How should we be thinking about the space between sounds? And does that also tie into our Jewish communities in some way?
Yes. Pausing is important. I was trying to think of a good example of this from an audiological perspective. I think that there are times when I work with somebody who has a hearing loss, where a lot of times the things that are the most difficult to understand are when people they drone on and on and on and on and on, right? There is no break in their speech. And they don't have any inflection in their speech either. I don't know if you've ever worked with somebody or listened to somebody where it just continually goes on and on and on.
I will say Dan and I both do that plenty, and I get the pleasure of editing myself and Dan on that very front.
Yeah, so when there is no break, it doesn't allow actually the brain to process what's happening. And also what I would say is my pause that we do every day, 3 times a day, or maybe more, or 4, is the Shema, where we actually take a moment to be called upon to hear, which takes a moment, right? So we say Shema Yisrael, hear Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, God, our God is one. Or you could say, hear Yisrael, you God wrestlers, right? Oneness is God. Or you could there's so many ways you can position those words to think about them in English. What are the texts that we are looking at, and how do we use them? I'm wearing a Svara cap, and I love the method of Svara where we take it word by word, and we actually try to figure out what are these words telling us, and how can we use this information to uplift and enliven us. I talked to my brother Gray Hagans, who's awesome, and you all should know him. He's the National Praxis and Visionary Director or Manager at Bend the Arc. I think I'm getting his title wrong, but it's amazing. And what he says is that we actually don't know enough to proceed. We've been acting from a place or moving from a place of thinking that we know a lot, and we don't. Historically, that we don't know how this country has perpetuated racism in its structures and in its policies. We don't know enough about that. They don't teach it to us in school, right? And so I think we need to get clearer about the ways in which anti-Blackness has lived in America in particular. the way that anti-Blackness gets pushed against other communities of marginalization. That's one area of study that Gray would say we need. But we need to be learning more. We're coming from a place of we know very little about our own history for anti-Blackness, but also I think there's a lot of Jewish American history that we don't know that could inform how we move forward.
I wanted to ask you a question that I've asked some of the other people in this series. I'm curious about your take in particular on it, which is a question about whether just grappling with the ideas that understanding gender differently has brought to us, does that help us think about Judaism differently by analogy? In a world in which there's not a binary thinking about gender, what might it look like not to have binary thinking about Judaism? And to say it's not just Jews and non-Jews, there's other ways that one could relate to Judaism. And I don't know if it's a related question or a totally different question, but I'm thinking, for example, like, are there things that I think we've talked a lot in this conversation about what Judaism and Jews could learn from other communities and other experiences. I'm wondering what Judaism potentially has to offer to folks who may themselves not be Jewish, whether they might want to convert or not.
You know, I'm a Reconstructionist, and I really believe, like, in the ways in which Mordecai Kaplan, blessed memory, the founder of the Reconstructionist movement, was like, there are many different ways to be Jewish. That actually we have manifested Judaism in many different ways across the centuries in different parts of the world in such beautiful ways. And that when we cut ourselves off from any of those particular things, that we're actually, it's like, you know, it's almost like we're cutting off some of ourselves. So if we don't understand or like appreciate the cultural ways in which Judaism has thrived throughout the world, that has given us beautiful languages and poetry and art, like, we're cutting something off if we only focus on like maybe the liturgical or the learning that happens with Talmud, or if we don't focus on the ways in which we have created such beautiful food, or the ways in which like we've actually have a culture of learning, of wanting, of desiring to know as much as possible, but then to be critical of it, to ask questions of it. I think that is something that we have to offer as Jews. This appreciation of the many different ways in which you can be Jewish. I will say that one of the things that I really, really love about the way we study, this actively asking questions of the text as generative, like that it's not something to be, you're not doing it to be derogatory of the text. Like, we actually hold these texts as sacred. And also we're very critical sometimes of them as we look at things like maybe the Breathe Act, which is an act that's been proposed through the Movement for Black Lives to actually allow for Black folks to breathe in this country unstifled, right? To be able to live and thrive. We can ask questions of this text and say, you know, this is directly from my brother Grace. Like, there are questions we can ask. What is this text asking of us? Are there things about us that need to change in order for the things within this act to be true? Are there ways in which the surroundings, our culture, our peoples need to change in order for these things to be true? This is Jewish tradition, asking questions of a thing that we want to be real in this world. And we can do that with the Breathe Act, like we can do it with Torah. And that, I think, is an offering of Jewishness to our world.
So I love that. And in the spirit, I'm going to close with a question where I'm going to challenge a Jewish text or a Jewish liturgical moment. And it ties to the points about binaries and thinking about Judaism beyond binaries, all of this. Lately, I've been really digging Havdalah, the service that marks the end of Shabbat and the beginning of the week. It's important for me, and I've long held that I think it's one of just the gems of Jewish creation or Jewish creativity. It's very sensory. There's smells, there's sights, there's sounds. It's awesome. My wife and I have lately been doing Havdalah each Saturday night. Now, like, look, I'm a rabbi, of course, and I do lots of Jewish things. Like, we have not always done this. We haven't always, I mean, we've lit candles on Friday night, like on and off. But lately, I've just sort of felt like this would be great. And since the pandemic, we've done a lot more of it. And I've been sitting with the liturgy. And the way that this prayer closes, it's a set of 4 blessings. And the last one is like, hey, everyone, binaries. Dear world, like blessed are you, God, et cetera, who makes all these binaries. Here they are. First, between holy and unholy, between light and darkness. Now, I don't say this one, but it also says between Jew and non-Jew. It would be ludicrous for me to say that when literally my partner isn't Jewish and we are saying it together. And then it closes with like the big one, which is between holy and unholy again, which is like the moment that Shabbat ends and you're now in the new week. So it's like, hey, everyone, there are 2 of everything, this or that. It's hard for people like me, and like I hope more and more of us who resent or want to upend binaries to lean into that. And so my question is, given that we have texts like that, given that we have challenging moments, we should look for when, even in the tradition, they're upended. And recently, Passover happened, and Shabbat was right before Passover. And there was this hilarious but awesome thing, because when you have Shabbat before Passover, you can't say, blessed are you, God, who distinguishes between holy and profane, or unholy, because the thing that follows is also holy. It's Passover. So it would be like a big old slam on Passover to say you're normal and mundane. So instead, you say this bizarre phrase, which is, who separates between holy and holy. It doesn't make any sense. It's saying you separate between a thing and also that thing which is the same. But I think there's teaching there. And so on a closing note, I was curious if you could help us think about those binaries, think about the world that we are inhabiting and that we want to create, and ask, are there ways, just as we see a difference between holy and holy, it seems the same, that there is some difference that we might want to create in our world that might not be apparent for us. Kind of open floor. What's your take?
I love the rabbis sometimes. Sometimes I don't love them as much, but I love the rabbis when they just make up something different, because they know what they have created before isn't working. And I think that is part of the answer. We see this happening all the time, particularly in the liturgical tradition, but also you see this in Gemara, in the Talmud. You'll see that they look at something in Torah and they say, you know what? I don't think that's working for us anymore. So what do? They create midrash, or they create all of these twists and turns through their conversation in the Talmud to say, you know what? Maybe we just need a different rule now. I think there is wisdom. Even if you've created it before, there's wisdom in seeing that I'm different now. The situation is different now, and we need a new thing. So we can smash the binaries, even the ones that we've created, because we know in this moment, as a human who exists in the realm of non-binary, the fact that I exist means that these binaries need to go, right? Or that they don't exist, at least for me. I will say, though, what I don't want us to do is to eliminate the distinctions that people have for themselves in service of kind of smashing the binary for me. And what I mean by that is, I don't want to erase somebody's identity in service of holding up mine. It's the same way that happens with race, right? Like that I need to somehow make me superior to other people. And I don't want that to happen, because the binary works for some people. It doesn't work for all people. And so what I see with the rabbis doing is they say, it's not working for us. So we're going to create a new thing that doesn't make this distinction between holy and profane. It says we're going to be between, which to be between a thing means that like there's flux, there's fluidity. I can dig that. I pray every day that we find the courage, like the rabbis, to make those changes as we see fit along the way. They gave us that blueprint. Let's use it.
Thank you so much, Koach, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thanks for having me. I've had a great time.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to close out this conversation by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to all of our social media pages. You can go to Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. All of our handles are just at Judaism Unbound. You can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com, and you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We also really deeply appreciate when you are able to send us a financial donation of any amount on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. And you can do that at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.